Hard to overstate that concern. So I'm hoping in the presentation you or the project folks will talk about that.
Yes, and because it is a workshop, I mean, we'll obviously be here all day. I'm going to have a brief introduction, but
Oh, you're the
in order
MC?
to, I'm sorry?
Are you more the MC?
Well, you're the MC, but here we'll be here to answer questions and have some dialogue back and forth, but also going to try to not be too repetitive with the same information. So I'm going to provide just really the overarching background for the temporary urgency change petition this year, which we originally received in January and issued an order in February. We had a workshop on this topic in February. Based on requests for modification, we issued another order in April and had another workshop just last month on May 20th. And now we have before us a renewal request for the TUCP that has the principal things outlined on the slide. It's to extend the existing TUCP order for another 180 days, but also to make changes for July through the rest of the year, as shown on the slide. And to date, and this is, speaking to, that the fact that this is going to be coming back, before the board, potentially before the board, we've received to date nearly 500 objections, petitions for reconsideration, approximately 100, probably more than that now, comments just on the Sacramento temperature issue alone. All of these comments are being posted and are being considered both in the consideration for the renewal of the TUCP order and also in, as I'll be speaking to, about the Sacramento temperature management plan, which also will require executive director approval. So the commenters have been from all areas, public elected representatives, water agencies, state and local agencies, environmental organizations. For a bit of context, we're really talking about two things here today, since we're talking about the TUCP to make changes in D1641 requirements, but also there's Order 90-5, which has long-standing requirements with regard to control of operation of Shasta Dam for maintaining temperatures in the Sacramento River for winter-run Chinook salmon. What happens every year with this plan, it allows for generally depending on how much water is available in storage, allows shifting of the temperature control point upstream versus downstream, depending on how much water it has. And this is really getting at, in every year, it's one of those, maximizing with beneficial uses. It's like, well, the water is being released both for temperature control, but then it's also being diverted and used throughout the system. But years like this, as you'll see, stress all of that, because then you get to those basically those hard points where, like, how do you just achieve any specific goal, and do you have the flexibility to achieve those multiple goals? So what's the hard stressor? So one of the hard stressors here is, like, what is the temperature control you need to protect endangered winter-run salmon? Because, as many of you might recall, we had a failure last year with controlling temperatures and leading to mortality of 95% of the winter-run salmon. What was required in the order issued by this board in last fall was to do a hindcast as a means of trying to figure out, well, what went wrong? What did we learn from that to avoid problems this year? That report was prepared, and I'll leave to the Bureau to really speak a bit more about that. But one of the things we learned from that is that it's critical in terms of when you're modeling and you're using a temperature control device. That's one of the things, using some of the side gate operations, the inside gate operations, to delay that, because that's when the model doesn't do a particularly good job of estimating temperatures. So also mindful of what occurred last year, this year's order required submittal early of the temperature management plan. So 90-5 typically requires it later in the year, but because it was a dry year and because of the failure last year, this order this year required it to be submitted earlier for a final plan to be submitted by June 1st. So the plan was developed in collaboration and working with the other agencies to come up, well, what is a plan to achieve temperature compliance? And in this case, because there were limited supplies, it was looking at just maintaining temperature control at a very far upstream point, the Clear Creek compliance point, to meet that 56-degree target. So the plans were submitted over a period of a couple of months in April and May, and I think I have the next slide here. And yeah, so it was submitted by the early May with the update, and it was provisionally approved by the executive director on May 14th. And the main provision there was because there was, because it was very close and not a lot of water, it was provisionally approved upon, well, is this plan going to work this year because of the failure last year? So it required the Bureau to immediately notify the board if it looked like the plan could not be implemented. So, and we got an update, I think May 20th, we got from Reclamation, and at that point they were continuing to state that temperatures could be maintained through throughout the season. But on May 29th, we were informed by the Bureau of Reclamation that the temperatures could not be maintained. And there were meetings starting then and basically almost continuously since that time working with the Bureau, with the Department of Water Resources and the fishery agencies. Well, if that's not the plan, what plan could the Bureau propose that would achieve temperature goals? And as you'll be seeing, and it's a flavor here because it's important that there is this, on-the-fly balancing that is occurring here, because it became clear because of the lack of cold water in Shasta that maintaining under any circumstance the 56-degree temperature target at Clear Creek would not be possible. So adjustments, the Bureau needed to make adjustments to the plan. Well, what's the plan of operation that could achieve some adjusted temperature targets in Sacramento? So on May 29th, also following that being informed, the executive director suspended the TMP, the temperature management plan, until a new plan could be prepared. So, I'm sorry? Oh, yes, thank you. So, since that time, the Bureau has been working with us, also with Department of Water Resources and the fishery agencies, NIMS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, to determine, well, what is a plan that could work? And this is far from an optimal plan because the information indicated that you could no longer achieve that 56-degree temperature compliance at Clear Creek. So what could be the adjusted operations? And by June 16th, they'd come up with the elements of the plan. The plan has still not been formally submitted to the State Water Board because there's a lot involved in doing this. It's not just like what's the interim release and other elements of it, but how do you work this into the balancing overall operations of the system? And frankly, that's a large topic of the conversation today, is what are the implications of this revised temperature management plan on system-wide operations. So on the 16th, though, the elements of a plan and how that would be carried out and how you would have successful temperature control, the key elements of that were to have base releases from Keswick Dam of 7250 CFS starting now and through the rest of the year, but operating that in a real-time manner to see, well, is there some adjustment that could be needed? Because the key goal is how do you meet temperature in the moment, but how do you also conserve sufficient water so you don't lose temperature control throughout the temperature control season? Another key provision of it is it's not to achieve the 56 degree, but it's to target a 57 degree and to avoid excursions above 58, which immediately causes some increased mortality over this time frame. But again, there's that balancing that's coming in. But that release of 7250, to put it in perspective, the initial plan, and you'll hear more about the numbers from the Department and the Bureau, but the initial plan was calling for releases in June, July, and August of 8,500, 9,000, and 8,500 CFS. So this is a large quantity of water that's now being maintained in storage in order to maintain temperature control relative to the initial plan. But this was the Bureau's plan, the Bureau's proposal now to actually try to achieve some of what had been proposed in their earlier plan. So that is what is in the process now of coming before us for executive director approval after it goes to the fishery agencies for, more full evaluation, because a lot is happening in a short period of time.
I have a couple of quick questions.
Yes.
When you say the base flow now to the end of the year, the end of the water year?
I'm sorry, through June, July, and August,
Okay.
and with some lower flows, ramping down into the fall. And that's a base flow, recognizing that there's need to manage this tightly here. So that's what it is initially, but it's not saying, well, this is what it will be exactly through the rest of the year. But it's like now continuing to get updated temperature information to see how the models are performing and to update it with new information. We're going to be getting a little bit of a heat storm coming up here. So based on all of that, how might that need to be adjusted through the year? But that's what it needs to be for now. And any adjustments to that, some of the key provisions, the key elements of the plan that's being developed is it would require real-time monitoring and assessment. So if it looks like the Bureau is not going to be able to meet, keep it below 58 degrees, there would be real-time meetings called, and how should operations be adjusted to meet temperature. So to give a bit of a flavor for this, to look forward, I want to take a step now and just look a little bit backward. And first, to orient ourselves, this is an example of some raw data that's collected to inform temperature management. This is, and you don't have to worry about looking at the numbers, but it's just showing what it shows are what are the temperatures of various blocks of water at different depths in Shasta, because that's probably one of the principal things that tells you how much cold water you're going to have to work with, to put into the models and operate through for the rest of the year.
You get these every day?
Well, no, and this is this is, they based on 90-5, they do different frequency of measurements. So year-round, maybe once a month, but then as it gets later into the temperature control season, every 2 weeks. So rather than spending a lot of time on this, I'm going to show what you can do with that information rather on a colorful chart, which shows last year this was the temperature profile, and there's a lot of information here. This is showing how every time temperature is measured, if you take that, monthly through most of the year, but then more frequently during the temperature control season during the summer, you can see, well, how much cold water there is in Shasta, and this is showing it for 2014. And one of the key things to look at there is that, well, getting into the end of August, when we lost temperature control last year, there wasn't a lot of cold water there. So this informs the next year in terms of, well, depending on what you have to work with, how are you going to manage into the new year? So to compare and contrast, this is now imposing 2015 on the 2014 data based on the first couple of readings in 2015. It's a bit of an animation here, and you can see with the same blocks of water how much of the coldest water is available here, because this informs a few things. What do we have to work with this year? And it shows how important also it's going to be to track this to see how does the actual data mesh up with our with the Bureau's proposed operations, and does it look like you're going to be able to achieve success, maintain temperature control? So moving through, this is like adding another month, and you can see it's fairly similar. And as we heard earlier in some earlier workshops, we were fortunate in having more storage than the same time last year. That's showing the very top, some of the warmer water there, and similar quantities of colder water, and similarly through April. But now in the time period of which it looked like, and so this is showing now late March, early April, the time at which the temperature management plan was developed by the Bureau and submitted to the State Water Board for approval, to the Fishery Agency State Water Board. But after that time, you can see some of these temperature profiles show now in the beginning of end of April, early May, and into May, and into late May, and then into June. That block of the darkest color, some of the coldest water, there's much less cold water than there was actually at the same time last year.
And we talked about that at the last workshop as a function of there simply not being snowmelt going in.
And there's been, that's one of, you look at that, basically that cookie cutter there that's taken out is like what caused that? Is that because there was less inflow of the coldest water and snow melt? But there's also information now that there's some problem with temperature readings. So the Bureau can provide more information on this when they make their presentation. But show it here because it's going to be very important to not just rely upon a few readings and then a plan based on those readings for the full year, it's going to require some tracking of this, the real-time management, and coordination of the group that's been working together. And it's like, well, based on what's happening now, based on the operations over the next 2 weeks with the heat storm, what are we going to be able to achieve?
In response to the chair's question earlier, though, how often is it being tested? You have that chart. Sounds like every 2 weeks.
And it's every 2 weeks, and now, and there's actually some discussion, I think the Bureau and some of the fish agencies can discuss. I think what is in process now is even trying to do some real-time measurement with some equipment that's in place. But I'll leave that. That's a good question for them later, because if it is that critically important,
Right.
you know, how do we make sure we have the best information to inform operations? Of course, you know, when I say real-time, day to day doesn't necessarily help more. You still have to, you know, it takes at that point longer to remodel and reassess a changing condition. But I think the work that's going to be done here is to strike the balance to do adequate monitoring to inform updates to this critically important plan. Sorry, and there was just one more there. So you can see at least the trajectory that is in place there, but it's going to be important to see how does that, you know, how will that affect the proposed operations. But this provides, in a very simple form, why there would be a need if you want to achieve the goals of temperature control this year. 2 big changes from last year. Well, it's going to require a change in the quantity of water to release to maintain the limited quantity of cold water, but also not meeting a 56 degree is not, you know, if you were trying to meet 56 degree, you would be depleting cold water even faster. Therefore, that's why looking at something 57 degree and even higher, it's just striking that balance.
I know that's going to come up a number of times. Can you explain that again for the folks who are listening? I've gone over that a couple of times.
Why is that?
Why
Why the balance?
Yeah, how you
When
amount versus temperature, and why it's not linear.
And why it's not
Linear.
linear. When you're releasing generally what you need to do to maintain temperatures downstream at Clear Creek. And I'll show you actually even a chart that shows one more chart. In fact, maybe I'll just go to that here. This might be. I'll answer your question. First, I'll orient you onto this chart. This is showing this year. This is showing temperatures at different locations. It's showing it at the lower line. That's the temperature control device. That's what's being released from Shasta. Then it's showing at Clear Creek downstream, which is the temperature compliance point. There's and also at Keswick Dam in between. So between the temperature control device at Shasta, that lower line, and Keswick Dam at River Mile 302, the blue line, the temperature increases just because it's moving and it's warming up. As it moves downstream from Keswick Dam, and that's the area where the winter run salmon are, and between Clear Creek, it's warming up even more. So it takes some both volume and sufficiently low temperature to achieve the temperature control that you're desiring to achieve over some distance. But it's a good question, and it's an important point, because as you can see, just recently, there was excursions above 58 degrees, which we're trying to avoid this year at the Clear Creek compliance point, and come back down, because some of the operations, and the operators can talk more about this, you're steering something that is, you know, you have to make adjustments to some extent based on what the weather forecast is, and it's very sensitive to these heat storms. So though you have some control that you can maintain, it really depends on air temperatures. And if you try to maintain temperatures beforehand to achieve certain temperature goals, lower temperature goals, and then it doesn't turn out, you've now wasted cold water you could have conserved for later in the season. So this is a difficult thing to do, and which is why there's a number of folks and agencies looking at it, and why the real-time operation is what's the best way of prolonging the use of cold water through the temperature control season while meeting temperatures in the moment. Does that answer your question? Okay. So with that, that's the last chart that I have. So I'm going to just discuss next steps. We've received the key elements, and you know that's all out there, and there's a multiple page document which really goes into quite a bit of detail summarizing how we would get through this temperature control season. But now the Bureau needs to submit their proposed plan to the fishery agencies for them to do a consultation on that. And again, some of this has been happening on the fly just because decisions, at least we need to know provisionally what needs to happen now, and they're operating under the provisions of the key elements of this plan. But then once the fishery agencies do their consultation, then it would come to the executive director for approval of the plan consistent with Order 90-5 and the TUCP. Also, in the next couple of weeks, will be a busy couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at the latest information. We have had already the submittal from the Bureau and the Department with regard to renewal of the TUCP, but we're also awaiting the information from the fishery agencies for that consultation on that, so we can, so the executive director can issue an order on the renewal of the TUCP by July 1st. And with the question that had come up earlier, and I must say I share, Board Member Dodok, I share your concern, and earlier in the year we had hoped to get something to the board earlier with regard to the petitions for reconsideration, but similar to last year, with the changes evolving over time and the need to make decisions in the moment, it's been a difficult process. But I heard what you said, and to figure out a better way of doing this, we will attempt to do so. But it's been difficult with changing, new wrinkles on what happened last year. It looks like now we're on a trajectory again to get before you, a board, to address the petitions for reconsideration late summer, early fall, which is after.
You would
Yes,
like it to
yes.
be.
Well,
We
it's
would like it
after-
to be.
After
Well-
providing you opportunity to weigh in on that, on the key decisions that
As
need to be
board.
made in the moment.
Individually. A quick question on this. I know that the agencies have been meeting around the clock, and I gather from some of the press statements I got that there's been engagement with at least some of the stakeholders at this point. There was some critique of that, but it appears there have been some discussion with some of the contractors at least. Have there been discussions with the environmental stakeholders or other stakeholders?
Yes,
to date by the-
there were a series of calls and press conferences. So when this was rolled out last week, everyone was informed with that. Although what we've been saying, this will be the forum really to hear the comments all together. But yes, it's been, the information was both presented as it was rolled out, and particularly with the water users, water community, there were a series of meetings even before that rollout, and that, well, these are the things that are being evaluated now, to give an early heads up as to what would be the water supply effects, because these are large water supply effects. The changed operation that the Bureau is proposing will have large effects system-wide, and they can talk more about that because and the department, because it becomes the big question of how do you now balance the system in terms of, if you're keeping what seems to be here something like 250,000 acre-feet more in storage, and they can confirm that number, how does that get distributed through the system, both in terms of Folsom end of September storages, exports south of Delta, and that's both exchange contractors and refuges, wetlands, also have effect immediately upstream on the Sacramento in terms of settlement contractors. From staff perspective, we've been encouraging, well, it seems that this is a big hit. It needs to be distributed throughout the system. There's some hard stops in there which are recognized, but given that, how does this get equitably distributed throughout the system? We've also been sharing, and it's probably one more point to make here with regard to the TUCP order. Even as that's being considered, one of the hard stops is not necessarily delta outflow in terms of how it's before the executive director now for consideration, that in light of efforts to conserve water in the delta, and some of the work of the Delta Water Master and voluntary curtailments, things like that, if there's water savings that can be achieved with that, that can be folded into the calculation of net delta consumptive use, and therefore provide some benefit throughout the system as well, because it means the Bureau and the department can ultimately release less water for maintaining the same level of net delta outflow. So all of those things are being evaluated in the moment now fact, we're going to take some action on that within the next couple of days because every drop of water helps balance the system.
So I'm assuming we'll hear more about all those different pieces.
And to the extent that we haven't covered it here, we'll be here to answer questions.
No, good, and I suspect we will hear from assorted parties from every different walk. It's just, I recall from the last meeting, it wasn't the 20th, but the meeting after with our drought update when this issue came up. It's just very important to me, given that this is a very important forum, but it's a short forum. It's those multiple conversations that you all as staff, Mr. Howard, folks from the state, other state and federal agencies can have in conversation with people who can come up with the ideas. This is really a community challenge, and we need to be inviting everybody to think creatively about how to navigate our way through it. So that's why I asked the question, because I had asked to make sure that there was stakeholder engagement, and I expect we'll hear mixed comments on that. So I'll just wait and hear it, but I just encourage, even between now and July 1st, as hard as it is and as hard as you are all meeting with each other, to take the time to meet with the various stakeholder groups that have legitimate concerns, whether it's about fish, municipal use, or agriculture.
If I could chime in on that, I agree. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and the thoughts of the agencies on how to improve on that process going forward and even in future years. I know there are a number of stakeholders that are interested in being, and not just this year, but in previous years, being involved in some of the discussions for the temperature plan. And so how could, without bogging things down, what processes could be in place in order to bring in the NGOs and the water users? Because oftentimes they have a lot of good ideas, not just about how to move water around, but also how to manage the system.
If I may say, one of the things that clearly that I've been suggesting in all of these venues is that the board, because I've heard this message before, we do not want to be, will not be an impediment to good ideas to be implemented, but some of these are a heavy lift, and as you'll hear from the department and the bureau, say this additional, if the plan as proposed would back up another 250,000 acre-feet of storage into Shasta, that will immediately have some effects on the COA, the Coordinated Operations Agreement. And it also begs, well, is it going to be possible to use that water at some later time? That starts impinging on, annual contract years and things like that and carry over to next year. Many of those are institutional barriers that can be broken with agreements between parties, but I think the board, I've heard loud and clear, and you're saying, would entertain, and Tom would entertain, the executive director would entertain and not be an impediment to ideas that get us through this.
I have an additional request, and I realize we're not here to make any decisions, but at some point we will be looking at this as a board, and what I'd like to see is something along the lines of a matrix that indicates the recommendations on the releases, what that means in terms of temperature, what that means with respect to the other facilities that come into play, Folsom, Oroville, and what that means playing on out with SAC settlement contractors, exchange contractors, Friant, the refuges, and the COA. So some way, I'm trying to do it myself on one sheet and fill in the blanks, but I don't want to be the one guessing what those impacts are. And I know we're going to hear from folks about impacts, but to the extent possible, if you could synthesize that for us on one document, that would be helpful.
I think, and we can certainly build on it and make it more intelligible. One of the good things in the drought, we get now, the operations, the overall operations of the state and federal project, and where, the big water is going, if you will, and it has the COA balance, things like that. We have things like that already posted on our website, but perhaps we need to make it even more easily discernible and available, because they are important questions. We agree.
Yeah, the communication about it is really challenging. It not only helps us, but it helps other people understand the complexity of those trade-offs. And the issue, it's not about not being an impediment to good ideas. It's about seeking them out so that you all get the help you need. All of it. I was going to say, Dee Dee and I love doing that. All of us like to do. We're all problem solvers. But under this institutional system, we can't talk to everybody unless we're up here and everybody's out here in public, which is perfectly fine. It just is more limited than we like to be. So I'm just saying I want you all to do that, because I believe, I know Dee Dee and others believe, that you're going to end up, you need all the help you can get figuring this out. So it's not to make it a, you know, a huge party, but there are a lot of people with good ideas who need to be challenged to figure out how to help us find that. There is no sweet spot here, but how to find that path to navigate among some terrible choices. So I really think this has to be a community conversation as best we can, as opposed to in the back rooms, understanding that you guys need to be able to sit and talk and do your consultations and all those things too. But some of the best ideas can come from the folks who are out in this room and not in the room today.
I appreciated you giving that example just now, Les, about looking into how the contracts are formulated and what kind of agreements can be struck. And that speaks to my general comments that I began with, which is, you know, let's expand the toolbox in areas maybe we haven't gone before with this type of situation to co-manage. And so in that spirit, do you see a role with the stakeholder input to come forward with those type of institutional fixes, and then utilize your multi-agency group and the modeling tools to try different scenarios? Is there a kind of a technical group interaction that could come out of that would be very focused? That's my question generally.
I mean, there is certainly the group now that's going to be doing, there's the RT dump, which has been, you know, looking at overall operations with regard to the adjusted standards. Now there's the other layer now of Shasta temperature management control. So those are both venues for those things to occur. We've heard from folks on the Sacramento, and it's one of the things we've been discussing as well, how can they be more involved in some of the solutions, because they have been quite collaborative and helpful in all of this. But is there an additional role for them to weigh in? So the technical conversations are happening where, you know, you do the what ifs, if you will, and evaluate what are the hard stops. Probably the hardest questions with regard to that are the ones where it will require agreements, where if it starts affecting the COA and starts affecting moving allocations, if you will, into future years, things like that. That's edgy stuff that has large implications in terms of, you know, value of water and money changing hands. So I'm hearing those. I think those conversations need to happen, because they're potential technical solutions, but there might be some institutional impediments or financial impediments. So we need to evaluate those and evaluate what are the hard stops. And I heard, and you'll be hearing again about Folsom, you know, so where exactly is the hard stop there? And it's something around 120,000 acre feet. Below that, that's when you're going to start needing barges and things like that for getting the water supply on the end of the year. But even that becomes a question. So is that a hard stop, or is that money that needs to be expended to make it happen because the water needs to go elsewhere? So it's kind of hard. It's hard to figure all of this out. But
yeah, barge water is better than no water.
Yeah, well, yeah, but everybody's, you know, that's going to be, there's large sums involved in terms of doing all of this. So it's hard conversations. So certainly the nature of the conversations I've been having is just looking at, well, what are technical answers to do, and from the, I think you'll hear from the fish agency perspective and from a staff perspective, when we have endangered species concerned and winter run salmon, that's one of the hard stops, and that you can make trade-offs for that, but that's a, you know, how far do you go with that if there is still a plan that can achieve success that the Bureau has proposed? So all of those things you feed in and see, is there any other alternative solution? But I hear what you're saying, and will continue to encourage and listen to folks and encourage that collaboration and discussion.
I guess I just have one comment for those who will be coming up next or over the day. When you're making proposals for pushing out payback, if you will, in terms of water to the future, we all have to be cognizant that there may not be a lot of water in the future. And so if your idea is we'll spend water now and we'll get it back next year, that's probably not secure enough. We're going to need to be looking at what if we don't get it for, like the Australians, for 10 more years, or 5 to 10 more years. it's quite serious.
But this would be water that's available now, not counting on something to occur in the future. The water's in storage now. It just can't be moved because of the temperature challenge.
Someone going to be explaining that? I know we've gotten emails and press releases about that
Sure. Well, this
notion,
is,
and Senator Nielsen.
it's really as simple as by reducing now the level of releases from Shasta that would have been used for a number of uses, throughout the system. It would have gone for water supply to Sacramento settlement contractors. Some would have been used for salinity control in the Delta. Some would have been exported. That's the reservoir, as you've heard it described. It does the heavy lifting. It's the big reservoir here. But if you back up an additional 250,000 acre feet into it over a period of 3 months, that has to be picked up elsewhere. But the water is not lost. That means it's in Shasta. And it's perhaps even a curious exercise when all of this was being worked on last year. Had end of September storage been maintained at a higher level last year, then we would not have been facing by a similar amount the same constraints this year. But so the water's not lost. It does that job then. But at some point, you have to take the loss once if you want to be prepared for another dry year. Of course, that's the wrong answer. If next year is now a wet year and you restrict anything on the basis of having carryover for next year, you've erred.
I remember you saying that at our very first drought workshop, that no matter what you do, you're going to be wrong, because nobody can predict what's going to happen. So it's a judgment call every time.
Yep.
Right?
And I can understand it from the water supply perspective, and I heard it last year, and I hear it again this year. It doesn't matter if there's any more water available for this year. I need the water now.
But just to clarify, as far as or to compare last year to this year, as far as carryover and end of year last year, now, under the plan, and then that play of 250,000 or whatever that amount is, I don't know exactly, and where we would be end of year storage, carryover storage compared to last year.
The original April-May plan that was submitted, that was provisionally approved, would end up with an end-of-year storage just about the same as last year. And correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was something like 1,150, 1.15 million acre feet, something between 1.1, 1.2. The original plan would have ended at the same end of September storage. So this plan would be ending up higher.
So then and what we're talking about here is and I'm sure we'll talk about this in a more organized fashion through the course of the day, that there's also a proposal or dispute about what to do with that 250 at the end of the temperature control season.
Exactly, but
which is then a speculation about what we're going to need next year for salinity control. Again, where you can't know, but it's interesting.
It is. That's a challenge for the next year. But for this year, just to loop back to that, we certainly had an N of 1. We observed what happened last year. Of course, it's not the same. We're talking about managing. The proposal now is to manage to a higher temperature, but there's also, though a little bit more water than last year, it's not as cold. It's much warmer than last year, as you saw in those charts. So you don't have as much cold water to work with. It's not just the volume, but it's the quantity of cold water. So that's where the plan with the Bureau, in learning from that, has the revised plan for this year. But then as a separate and connected question, that's going to be now backed up in storage. How does that work? I think
right, and there are people who want that borrowed to go back to them. I suspect we'll hear different things, probably from some of the fish-related groups, but certainly from the Folsom-related concerned folks about their reservoir being drawn down that low while Shasta is relatively high, and who should benefit from that as we go forward. So, I mean, again, always complicated.
There's a lot of permutations.
Sorry, we asked a bunch of questions as long as you start, but I'm sure we'll hear about more.
That's fine. Happy to answer questions.
Questions? They're not going anywhere before we move.
So just another slide. There's more information on our drought webpage. I neglected to say you can subscribe if anybody in the room is not fully engaged. and get future updates. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. We'll be back to you a lot less. And before we go to our next presentation, we're joined by Assemblymember Olson. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you and good morning. I am Kristen Olson. I'm the Assembly Republican leader, but I also represent the north part of the Central Valley, Stanislaus and San Joaquin counties. And I understand that you guys are in a tough spot, balancing California's water needs during what is now 4 years of drought with no end in sight. And frankly, there simply isn't enough water to meet all the needs. But this can't continue to be a fight between farmers and fish. We don't want dead crops and we don't want dead fish. And the board needs to get much more creative in balancing the state's water needs. The solution simply cannot be continuing to cut water. You've cut water supplies to farmers, you've imposed cuts on cities, businesses, and families, you've curtailed junior and senior water rights in and around the Delta, in the North State, and in the northern part of the Central Valley. Ag has fallowed nearly 500,000 acres of land. Nearly 20,000 farm workers have been laid off. Food bank lines have tripled. Whole communities don't have water for showers or drinking water, and the list goes on. And all of this is because of a lack of water. And yet, the board simply continues to promote more cutbacks. We have to get much more creative and start focusing on ways to create more water. We want and we need healthy fisheries. We need healthy farms. We need a healthy Delta region, a healthy North State. We need a healthy Central Valley and a healthy Bay Area and Southern California. Holding more water in Shasta Reservoir doesn't help meet any of these needs. There remains a serious salinity problem in the Delta, and one that we absolutely must address, with or without the agreed upon releases from Shasta. The way to address salinity and the way to improve salmon runs long term is by expediting projects to increase water supply. Nothing else has worked. Nothing else will work. We've tried and tried and tried, and it's not working. The agreements crafted last May to improve Delta water quality and to provide water to farmers south of the Delta was one made by farmers, environmental stakeholders, government scientists, and water officials alike. Planting decisions were made based on those carefully crafted agreements, and we just cannot renege now. If the board reneges, it could lead to an additional 485,000 acres of fallowed farmland, more job losses, billions more in economic loss to the state of California. Our state simply cannot afford any of those actions. I implore you to let the May agreement stand and to start focusing on creating true solutions that balance California's water needs and that prioritize increasing water supply rather than curtailing water rights or continuing to cut back on water needs. Again, appreciate your attention to this issue today and implore you to let the May agreement stand and make sure that California can remain a thriving agricultural economy and a thriving fisheries economy as well.
Thank you very much. Pardon me one moment. Assemblyman, would you like to speak before we move to the next?
Good morning, Madam Chair, board members. Thank you for the opportunity to make a brief statement. I will keep it brief. I know my colleague just shared her concerns regarding the revised temperature plan, and I wanted to go on record, certainly driving home the importance to the board. Constituents of mine have made significant investments. Our community's made significant investments. Whoops, we got the temperature wrong is a wholly unacceptable reason to then change that plan. We have got to figure out how we can access additional waters, be creative, be flexible, and not leave folks in a lurch with millions of dollars invested, communities in peril. So I thank the board for their work and encourage you to seek out every available opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.